Proxies gathered in their masses. Proxyopolis at black masses. Boardrooms that plot destruction. Governance of death's construction. In C-suites the cash is burning as the war machine keeps turning. Remuneration in kind. Proxyopoly for greenwashed minds. Oh Lord, yeah! And welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades, aka Jesse Cole Burdick, here again with another exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for none other than a $2 trillion technology titan, Microsoft. That's right, Proxyopolis. Following the Proxyopoly score for Deutsche Bank, BlackRock, Tesla, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Meta Platforms, Amazon, Spotify, Apple, Alphabet, we now have on the docket today a scathing analysis of the corporate governance practices of one of the most renowned companies listed on any stock exchange in the United States, Microsoft Corporation. And now, without any further delay, we will dive into the Proxyopoly TM score for Microsoft. Introduction. Microsoft Corporation, a $2 trillion technology titan, faces its annual general meeting, AGM, on December 5th, 2025, with shareholders poised to evaluate its board and governance. Despite record financial performance propelled by cloud and artificial intelligence, for example, $76.4 billion in Q4 revenue, up 18%, Microsoft's corporate governance merits a hard look through the Proxyopoly TM lens. The company's rapid artificial intelligence expansion, with over 800 million monthly active users of AI-powered features across its products, magnifies the public impact of its decisions, yet the board's responses to shareholder concerns, such as opposing a report on AI misinformation that still drew roughly 18.7% support, raises questions about accountability. Using the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings, analogous to a, quote, beta, unquote, for public interest volatility in public markets, we critically assess Microsoft's governance and derive a final Proxyopoly TM score, followed by a scathing recommendation analysis for policy changes and director elections at the upcoming AGM. Diving into the Proxyopoly TM rating, starting with Proxyopoly TM rating number 1, Proxy Accumulation Resistance, or PAR. This rating measures how difficult it is for outside shareholders to accumulate enough proxy votes to influence or challenge management's control. Microsoft has scored a proxy accumulation resistance of negative 0.20. The slightly negative value indicates some structural barriers exist, though not as extreme as founder-controlled tech peers. Factors cited in the Proxyopoly TM analysis to support Microsoft's proxy accumulation resistance rating include one share, one vote capital structure. Microsoft has only one class of stock, with one vote per share, meaning no super voting stock shields insiders. No individual shareholder holds a dominant stake. Even co-founder Bill Gates now owns just approximately 1.3% outstanding votable shares, so power is dispersed. This egalitarian structure reduces accumulation resistance. Another factor cited in the proxy accumulation resistance analysis are shareholder meeting rights. Shareholders owning 15% of shares may call a special meeting, a relatively accessible threshold that empowers investors to act between annual meetings. Microsoft also adopted proxy access for director nominations, allowing significant long-term holders to nominate board candidates on the company's proxy, further lowering barriers to proxy contest efforts. Another factor cited in proxy accumulation resistance includes activist engagement history. Tellingly, Microsoft has taken a collaborative stance with at least one activist. In 2013, Value Act Capital amassed less than 1% stake and agitated for change. Microsoft struck a cooperative deal granting Value Act a board seat for President Mason Morfitt rather than fight a proxy war. Morfitt joined the board in 2014 and helped catalyze the successful Nadella-era transformation. This precedent of negotiation over confrontation suggests low hostility to proxy accumulation. Another factor cited in proxy accumulation resistance includes countervailing factors. Despite these shareholder-friendly provisions, practical hurdles remain. The bulk of Microsoft's stock is held by institutional investors, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, etc., each holding approximately 8% votable shares outstanding, that often side with management by default. The company's stellar stock performance, up nearly 980% in the past decade, also blunts activist interest. Success itself is a, quote, poison pill, unquote, against proxy rebellion. In short, while no structural weapons, such as dual-class shares, active poison pills, bar outsiders, galvanizing a majority vote against a popular management is inherently challenging. Overall, Microsoft's governance framework offers open channels for shareholder influence on paper, hence the modest proxy accumulation resistance. The negative tilt reflects that management's strong credibility and institutional support still resist any disruptive proxy accumulation. The true test would come if performance faltered. Only then would we see if these mechanisms genuinely empower shareholders or prove illusory. Next, we dive into Proxyopoly TM rating number 2 for Microsoft, Bylaw Fortification Index, or BFI. Bylaw Fortification Index gauges the degree to which Microsoft's bylaws and corporate governance policies fortify the board's power against shareholder intervention. Microsoft's Bylaw Fortification Index reigns in at negative 0.10. This near-neutral, slightly fortified score in the negative indicates Microsoft follows many governance best practices with a few entrenching provisions. Factors cited in the analysis for Bylaw Fortification Index include annual elections and majority voting. The entire board stands for annual election with no staggered terms, and directors must receive a majority of votes cast to be appointed or reappointed. These shareholder-friendly bylaws increase board accountability. An underperforming director can be voted out in 1 year. Indeed, Microsoft shareholders ousted no directors in 2024, but one nominee received only 92% support, signaling some discontent. These policies reduce Fortification by making it easier to remove or refresh board members. Another factor cited in the analysis for Bylaw Fortification Index include independent leadership in name only. Microsoft lacks an independent board chair. CEO Satya Nadella was elevated to chairman in 2021, but the board compensates with a lead independent director role. Currently, Sandra Peterson. The lead independent director can call executive sessions without the CEO and ostensibly counterbalance management. However, this arrangement is a governance half measure. An independent chair is widely recommended to check CEO authority. Microsoft's choice to reunify the roles under Nadella fortifies executive control. More on this under Entrenchment. Thus, while many governance practices are solid, the chairmanship issue adds to BFI's slight negative tilt. Another factor cited in the analysis for Bylaw Fortification Index include no supermajority requirements. The company has eliminated supermajority vote requirements in its charter. For example, mergers or bylaw changes. Only simple majorities are needed. This absence of supermajority hurdles make it easier for shareholders to amend bylaws or approve major actions, reflecting less fortification. Another factor taken into consideration for the Bylaw Fortification Index includes other protective provisions. Microsoft permits shareholders to act at special meetings. 15% threshold as previously noted, but notably does not allow action by written consent as is common. No such right is disclosed in governance documents. Requiring formal meetings for any action slows down insurgencies, implicitly fortifying the board's defenses. Additionally, Microsoft's charter includes standard Delaware provisions for indemnifying directors and limiting liability. Common legal shields, though not unusual enough to affect Bylaw Fortification Index materially. On balance, Microsoft's bylaws are mostly aligned with shareholders' interests. The board's willingness to adopt modern governance norms, such as annual elections, majority voting, proxy access, earns some credit. The main fortification, combining the chair-CEO role, prevents a fully neutral Bylaw Fortification Index. Microsoft's castle has its gates open to shareholders, but the king still sits on the throne wearing 2 crowns. Next, Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly score for Microsoft to be revealed at the end of the episode is Shareholder Hostility Quotient, or SHQ. Shareholder Hostility Quotient assesses management's attitude towards shareholder rights and responsiveness to shareholder concerns. Microsoft's Shareholder Hostility Quotient reigns in at positive 0.25. A moderately positive score here signals a subtle but notable streak of shareholder unfriendly behavior, despite the company's polite rhetoric. Factors taken into consideration for the shareholder hostility quotient include management versus shareholder proposals. Microsoft's board has a history of opposing virtually all shareholder-sponsored proposals, even on environmental social governance issues that arguably align with long-term stakeholder value. At the 2024 annual general meeting, the board recommended against 6 separate shareholder proposals, including reasonable requests for transparency. For example, reporting on human rights risks in conflict zones, and on how Microsoft's artificial intelligence might be used in oil and gas or could spread misinformation. All 6 were defeated, but not without sizable minority support. 15 to 36% voted for these initiatives. The 36.2% support for auditing artificial intelligence data sourcing and 32% for human rights hotspot risks indicate a significant block of shareholders felt management was too dismissive. The board's reflexive hostility to enhanced disclosure, particularly in an era when Microsoft's AI tools influence society, drives shareholder hostility quotient upward. It appears management prefers shareholders not second-guessing its societal impacts. Another factor taken into consideration for the shareholder hostility quotient includes case studies on sexual harassment reports. Tellingly, when shareholders strongly voice a concern, Microsoft can be forced to listen. In 2021, an investor resolution seeking a public report on Microsoft's sexual harassment policies, spurred by disturbing reports including misconduct by Bill Gates years prior, passed with approximately 78% approval. This rebuke came after Microsoft's board initially opposed the proposal. Once the writing was on the wall, the company conceded. It hired an outside firm and issued a comprehensive transparency report in 2022. The episode illustrates management's default hostility, resisting even as, quote, big mutual funds increasingly support investor challenges on ESG, unquote, until overwhelming shareholder pressure compels action. In essence, Microsoft's board had to be dragged into doing the right thing on workplace culture. Another factor taken into consideration for the shareholder hostility quotient includes engagement and outreach. To its credit, Microsoft does not conduct extensive shareholder engagement outside proxy season, claiming to incorporate feedback on governance and strategy. However, the persistence of contested issues on the ballot year after year, investors file similar proposals on artificial intelligence, ethics, climate, political spending, etc., suggests a pattern of half measures. The board's lack of proactive reform, for instance, failing to preemptively adopt reporting that a large minority clearly desires, can be seen as passive-aggressive hostility. Rather than negotiating and finding common ground with proponents, the company often waits for a high vote to force its hand. Another factor under consideration for the shareholder hostility quotient includes treatment of activists. In contrast to its stance on environmental social governance proponents, Microsoft's approach to hedge fund activists has been relatively accommodating, as noted with Value Act. This implies the board is more receptive to Wall Street's profit-driven critiques than to values or risk-oriented critiques from socially conscious shareholders. Such a dichotomy, embracing an activist who boosts share price while stonewalling investors who raise ethical concerns, hints at a priority misalignment that elevates the shareholder hostility quotient. In sum, Microsoft's shareholder hostility quotient of positive 0.25 reflects a management team that is politely but persistently resistant to shareholder influence, unless that influence aligns directly with financial metrics. The board's default posture is to defend the status quo, often at the expense of transparency and accountability. While not an extreme offender, it doesn't employ poison pills or sue dissidents, for example. Microsoft earns a mild scathing for talking the talk of shareholder-friendly governance more than walking the walk. Next Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score from Microsoft to be revealed at the end of this episode is the executive entrenchment factor, or EEF. The executive entrenchment factor examines how strongly entrenched the CEO and executive team are. For example, the difficulty of removing or counterbalancing top management. Microsoft's executive entrenchment factor, or EEF, reigns in at positive 0.40. This relatively high rating underscores significant CEO dominance and potential insulation from checks and balances. Underlying factors taken into consideration for the executive entrenchment factor include chairman-CEO combination. The single biggest contributor to entrenchment is that Satya Nadella serves as both chairman and CEO. In 2021, Microsoft's independent directors unanimously elected Nadella as chairman of the board, replacing the prior independent chair. This move concentrated authority in one person, effectively making Nadella his own boss in board meetings. As chairperson, he sets the board's agenda. As CEO, he executes it. This unity of command is great for swift decision-making, but poor for oversight. It violates governance best practice, calling for the chair role to be independent of management. The board tried to mitigate this by keeping former chair John Thompson as lead independent director, now succeeded by Sandra Peterson. But that is a weaker counterweight. Nadella's dual role is an explicit entrenchment choice, one that shareholders worried about power concentration should question. Another factor taken into consideration for the executive entrenchment factor includes board independence, or lack thereof. On paper, 11 of Microsoft's 12 directors are independent. In reality, subtle ties can compromise true independence. Many directors are current or former chief executives used to collegial differential board cultures. Notably, Nadella handpicked several board members during his tenure. For example, LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman joined after Microsoft acquired LinkedIn, presumably with Nadella's blessing. With Nadella now as chairperson, the dynamic is one where the board may be too aligned with or in awe of the CEO. The fact that Nadella won 94.3% shareholder support in 2024 despite this governance concern indicates shareholders to have been complacent, likely due to Microsoft's performance. The board's willingness to allow this structure suggests a reluctance to challenge Nadella, a hallmark of entrenchment. Another factor taken into consideration for the executive entrenchment factor includes longevity and succession. Nadella has been CEO since 2014, 11 years by the next AGM, and has no visible succession plan announced. Several top executives, for example, President Brad Smith or CFO Amy Hood, are strong, but the board has not signaled any transition timeline, implying Nadella will remain indefinitely. A long-tenured CEO can be good, but without clear succession planning, it raises risk of over-reliance and reduced board leverage. Moreover, Nadella's star status, often credited with reviving Microsoft, might make the board less inclined to hold him accountable on contentious issues. For example, pursuing risky acquisitions or massive artificial intelligence expenditures. They may feel, quote, lucky to have him, unquote, and thus cede excessive strategic control. Another factor taken into consideration for the executive entrenchment factor includes insider influence and culture. Microsoft's culture has historically been dominated by founder Bill Gates and longtime CEO Steve Ballmer, both now gone from management. Nadella is praised for transforming that culture, yet the board's handling of lingering founder influence was telling. In 2020, Bill Gates resigned from the board amid revelations of an inappropriate relationship with an employee, which the board had investigated. While the board did initiate a probe, Gates' exit was framed as voluntary. One could interpret that the board avoided open confrontation with the powerful founder, settling matters quietly. This episode reflects how deference to long, powerful figures can't persist. Today, Nadella occupies that revered status. It's notable that Microsoft's board has not added any outspoken critics or independent industry experts who might rock the boat. The nominees are largely establishment figures, CEOs, CFOs, former government officials, who are unlikely to aggressively confront management. This composition implies a congenial, even clubby board environment that insulates the CEO from tough scrutiny. All told, Microsoft's executive entrenchment factor, or positive 0.40, highlights a substantial entrenchment of executive leadership. Satya Nadella's visionary leadership gets justified praise for Microsoft's success, but from a governance standpoint, the company is increasingly a one-man show. Shareholders should be wary that even a brilliant CEO benefits from oversight. No executive should be indispensable and unchallengeable. Microsoft's current setup makes challenging Nadella's decisions or performance awkward at best and impossible at worst. That is a long-term risk to the company's resilience and to public trust, especially as Microsoft's decisions, particularly on artificial intelligence development, carry weight far beyond the boardroom. Next, Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score to be revealed at the end of the episode is the Regulatory Evasion Measure, or REM. Regulatory Evasion Measure evaluates Microsoft's propensity to skirt regulations, push legal limits, or evade regulatory accountability. Behaviors that can indicate risk to public market health. Microsoft's Regulatory Evasion Measure reigns in at positive 0.30. This moderately high score reflects a company that, while more restrained than some tech peers, has a history of regulatory run-ins and artful dodges. Factors taken into consideration for the regulatory evasion measure includes antitrust legacy. Microsoft is no stranger to regulators' crosshairs. In the landmark U.S. v. Microsoft case, the U.S. government found Microsoft illegally monopolized the web browser market by tying Internet Explorer to Windows. The 2001 judgment branded Microsoft's tactics as monopolistic under the Sherman Act. The company narrowly escaped a breakup and agreed to behavioral remedies, but only after dragging out appeals. This case cemented Microsoft's reputation for aggressively pushing boundaries, a classic example of regulatory evasion until caught. While 2 decades old, this ethos of win market first, deal with regulators later, arguably persists in modified form. Another factor taken into consideration for the regulatory evasion measure includes recent antitrust scrutiny. Fast forward to the 2020s, Microsoft has generally stayed out of the worst big tech antitrust scandals, perhaps learning from its past. Yet old habits die hard. A current example, Microsoft bundled its Teams collaboration software with Office 365, squeezing rival Slack. After Slack filed an European Union complaint, European regulators opened an antitrust probe, and Microsoft swiftly offered concessions, unbundling Teams in Europe to avoid fines. By May of 2025, the European Union signaled it would accept Microsoft's offer, sparing the company a potentially hefty fine. Notably, the European Union reminded that Microsoft had been fined approximately 2.2 billion euros over the years for bundling offenses and other antitrust breaches. Microsoft's pattern is evident. Engage in anti-competitive tying until challenge, then offer a fix to dodge the worst punishment. This cat-and-mouse approach to compliance nudges regulatory evasion measure upward. Another factor taken into consideration for the regulatory evasion measure includes regulatory cooperation, genuine or cynical. In areas like privacy and artificial intelligence, Microsoft positions itself as a constructive player with regulators, but with a strategic twist. President Brad Smith often calls for regulation of artificial intelligence and offers Microsoft's input in crafting rules. Cynics argue this is regulatory capture in disguise. By volunteering for self-regulation, Microsoft hopes to shape laws it can easily live with, while raising competitors' barriers. Similarly, Microsoft signaled onto European Union and United States data privacy frameworks and complies with most privacy regulations, yet it has lobbied to dilute some proposals behind the scenes. The company's huge market share in enterprise software gives it leverage to negotiate exceptions. For example, its contracts with governments often exempt certain cloud terms from oversight. These subtler forms of influence aren't illegal, but they show Microsoft's talent in bending the rules in its favor without overtly breaking them. Another factor taken into consideration for the regulatory evasion measure include lobbying and influence. Microsoft is a Washington, D.C. heavyweight, spending about $9 to $10 million on lobbying in 2024 alone, and maintaining a high-profile government affairs team. It actively lobbies on antitrust, tax, trade, and tech policy. Notably, after being caught flat-footed in the 1990s antitrust saga, Microsoft ramped up lobbying, and it paid off. The company has largely avoided being a prime target of the recent U.S. antitrust push, which focused more on Meta, Google, and Amazon. Microsoft's $69 billion Activision Blizzard acquisition faced Federal Trade Commission resistance, but Microsoft lawyered and lobbied its way to court victory and eventually deal closure in 2023. From the outside, Microsoft often appears a model corporate citizen, but its adept navigation of political currents suggests a calculated strategy to preempt or neuter regulation. This savvy can be positive when advocating ethical artificial intelligence use, or negative when it amounts to quietly dodging accountability. Overall, Microsoft's regulatory evasion measure of positive 0.30 indicates a company that operates near regulatory boundaries but usually manages to stay one step ahead of the sheriff. Its behavior isn't as brazen as some industry peers. No open defiance like certain social media firms previously aforementioned in this podcast, yet it's not saintly either. Microsoft will, quote, do the right thing, unquote, when compelled or when it aligns with business goals, but as evidenced by unbundling teams only under European Union pressure and opening data on sexual harassment only after a shareholder mandate, such patterns warrant a healthy skepticism from investors and regulators alike. In free market terms, Microsoft's clever avoidance of strict regulatory reckoning contributes a bit of systemic volatility. It leaves external watchdogs and shareholders to play catch-up to the company's maneuvers. Taking into consideration all of the aforementioned Proxyopoly TM ratings, Proxyopoly TM is now happy to present the final Proxyopoly TM score. Just to recap the previous Proxyopoly TM ratings, Microsoft's proxy accumulation resistance is negative 0.20. Microsoft's Bylaw Fortification Index is negative 0.10. Microsoft's Shareholder Hostility Quotient is positive 0.25. Microsoft's Executive Entrenchment Factor, or ETH, is positive 0.40. And Microsoft's Regulatory Evasion Measure is positive 0.30. And now we have to present the final Proxyopoly TM score for Microsoft, which is... Oh, it's coming! The Proxyopoly TM score is coming! The final Proxyopoly TM score for Microsoft is positive 0.65. Moderately high. Aggregating the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings, Microsoft's Proxyopoly TM score stands at positive 0.65. This score, on a theoretical scale of negative 1.0, low public impact risk, to positive 1.0, high public impact risk, signifies that Microsoft's corporate governance leans appreciably toward the entrenched insider-friendly side. And notably, the Proxyopoly score can go below negative 0.10 or above positive 1.0 given the egregious nature of either side. In plain terms, a single proxy vote in Microsoft has considerable beta for public market health. Voting with management supports a status quo that can be resistant to outside accountability, whereas voting against management could send outsized shock waves, given how tightly management holds the rein. The Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.65 is markedly higher, more risk-inducing than a neutral 0.0 score, though not as extreme as founder-dominated tech firms, which often approach or exceed positive 1.0. It encapsulates the findings that Microsoft's board and chief executive officer enjoys significant insulation, notably combining chair and CEO roles, a cozy board, and selective transparency, raising concerns for long-term shareholder value and stakeholder trust. However, the company's baseline governance structure, one share, one vote, no dual class shares with open meeting rights, prevents it from being a complete outlier. Shareholders do have tools at their disposal if they choose to use them. In short, Microsoft's governance is a paradox. Outwardly progressive but quietly entrenchment prone. This Proxyopoly TM score implies that investors should remain vigilant. The, quote, volatility impact, unquote, of casting a proxy vote against management at Microsoft is relatively high. It's a push against a well-entrenched machine, but one could yield outsized change if enough shareholders unite. Conversely, a vote blindly in favor of all incumbent directors might inadvertently reinforce practices that could incubate future crises, be it unchecked artificial intelligence risks, strategic missteps, or cultural issues. The onus is on shareholders at the 2025 Annual General Meeting on December 5th, 2025 to exercise their proxies wisely to nudge Microsoft towards true world-class governance. Thus, we've reached the end of part 1 of this 3-part Proxyopoly TM episode. Before moving on to the next 2 parts of this Proxyopoly TM episode, we will have a nice Proxyopoly TM intermission to allow the Proxyopolist at home to take a break and digest all the knowledge they've heard. And if it's too much for you and you gotta use the bathroom, I could chime in with some sponsored content and contributor content and offer you some nice Proxyopoly paper to wipe your ass with. And you can find it and print it off for yourself on the Patreon, which can be found at linktree/NASCARCosa. That's right, Proxyopolis. Linktree/NASCARCosa is where you get all your Proxyopoly needs for the Proxyopoly at your disposal. So, if you find yourself, you got a little gurgle in your stomach, you got a drive down in your jeans, why don't you just imagine the sponsored content and contributed content here? And if you want to contribute to this podcast, all you gotta do is reach out. I mean, this is an open invitation. What are you, cowards? I bet you're all afraid, shaking in your proxies, like, oh, what's he gonna do next? I hope it's not the company I work for. Oh, but what if you work for a private company? Oh, maybe I'm still not safe. Oh, you're gonna have to wait in time, Proxyopolis. Time will tell. And we're out of time for this first intermission. Now on to part 2 of this Proxyopoly TM episode. And welcome back, Proxyopolists, to part 2 of this Proxyopoly TM episode. The recommendations for policy reform. Based on the previous analysis, Proxyopoly TM will offer sets of recommendations. Governance policy changes to address Microsoft's risk factors. And in part 3, Board of Director voting recommendations for the annual general meeting to convene on December 5th, 2025. The aim is to strengthen accountability, reduce entrenchment, and better align Microsoft's immense corporate power with shareholder and public interests. Moving on to the governance policy change recommendations. Governance policy change recommendation number 1. Split the chair and CEO roles. The board should amend its governance guidelines to require an independent non-executive chair, reversing the 2021 decision and naming a new independent chair, even if it means asking Nadella to step down as chairperson while remaining chief executive officer, which would instantly improve oversight. An independent chair would set board agendas free of management influence and could more objectively evaluate chief executive officer performance, an especially vital check given Microsoft's scale. Many industry-leading companies such as IBM and Alphabet have moved to separate leadership structures. Microsoft should do the same to signal it values accountability over personality. This change would directly lower the executive entrenchment factor, or EET, and likely improve the company's standing with governance rights. Governance policy change recommendation number 2, enhanced shareholder rights, written consent, and lower thresholds. To empower shareholder engagement, Microsoft should allow shareholder action by written consent with appropriate safeguards. This provision would enable shareholders to act on urgent matters without waiting for the next annual general meeting or calling a special meeting. Additionally, considering lowering the special meeting threshold from 15% to 10%, a 10% threshold is becoming a best practice among large cap companies as it ensures even smaller shareholders or coalitions can be heard. These steps would further diminish proxy accumulation resistance, making the company more responsive in time to investor concerns. Governance policy change recommendation number 3, proactive environmental, social governance, and risk reporting. Rather than reflexively opposing all ESG-oriented shareholder proposals, the board should adopt a policy of proactive risk reporting on key topics like artificial intelligence ethics, data privacy, and human rights. For example, the board could voluntarily commit to publish an annual artificial intelligence impact transparency report detailing how Microsoft's AI products, from Azure AI to GPT-based copilots, guard against misuse, bias, or misinformation. This would preempt future shareholder resolutions and demonstrate leadership in responsible artificial intelligence. It aligns with CEO Nadella's own stated goal of, quote, elevating humanity with technology, unquote. Similarly, expanding reporting on lobbying to address regulatory evasion measure worries, disclosing not just dollars spent but policy asks made, would show good faith. These moves would reduce shareholder hostility quotient, replacing adversarial votes with collaboration. Governance policy recommendation number 4, board refreshment and skill realignment. The board should undertake a thoughtful refreshment plan, targeting long-tenured or less effective directors, and bringing in new expertise. In particular, adding a director with a deep knowledge of artificial intelligence ethics or cybersecurity expertise would be invaluable, given Microsoft's pivot to AI at scale and the associated societal risks. Currently, the board's composition leans heavily toward financial and operational executives, injecting an expert who has a public interest in technology perspective. For example, an academic or former regulator specialized in AI ethics would improve oversight of Microsoft's artificial intelligence endeavors. Likewise, recruiting someone with employee advocacy or consumer rights experience could help the board better grasp on-the-ground impacts, a gap exposed by past issues like employee harassment and contractor treatment. This recommendation flows from our findings on regulatory evasion measure and public impact. A more diverse expertise on the board can foresee public backlash or regulatory trouble before it boils over. Recommendations for governance policy change number 5. Strengthen lead independent director role if chair/CEO remains combined. If the board is unwilling to split the chairperson and chief executive officer roles immediately, it must, at minimum, bolster the lead independent director's powers. This could include formal authority to approve board meeting agendas, call meetings of independent directors at will, not just the after-the-fact executive sessions, and lead the CEO evaluation process. The lead director should also be given a prominent role in shareholder engagement, acting as an alternative voice to management. Essentially, institutionalize a counterweight to Nadella's influence. Ensuring the lead director rotates every few years can also prevent that role from becoming too cozy with management. These tweaks would somewhat mitigate the executive entrenchment factor or in the interim. By implementing these recommended reforms, Microsoft's board would demonstrate a serious commitment to robust governance befitting the company's global impact. It would likely improve the company's Proxyopoly TM score, lowering it toward the neutral, and reassure both shareholders and regulators that Microsoft can be trusted to govern itself responsibly even as it grows ever more powerful in the market. Having concluded the second part of this 3-part Proxyopoly TM episode, namely the Governance Policy Change Recommendation segment, we will now enter intermission number 2 for the Proxyopolist at home to digest all the information they have heard prior to diving into the final and third part of this Proxyopoly TM episode, where we will lay on the table the voting recommendations for Microsoft's upcoming annual general meeting, taking place on December 5th, 2025. And this is to allow some time for all those ballots to come in your mailbox, whether physically or digitally. See, that's how the proxy votes, ladies and gentlemen. Proxyopolis, theys and thems. Proxyopoly has no underlying initiative other than for you to vote your proxies. This protected trademark of educational and entertainment services, namely providing podcasts in the field of business and finance, is driven solely out of a passion for every person to vote their proxies. To reference several articles of Delaware corporation law, there is a time when a proxy is a person. And I will leave the Proxyopolist at home in this intermission with a thought-provoking question. At what point during the life cycle of the proxy is the proxy a person? And with that question, some follow-up questions may come about in your mind. For me, I would think to myself, gosh, that seems too personal to be the proxy. Isn't this supposed to be professional? I think when the proxy becomes a person, it becomes too personal to be professional. So how could the proxy be a person if it's too personal to be professional? If it delegates the voting rights to the proxy, and the proxy is a person who represents the interests at the shareholder meeting, does that mean that all the proxies voted are represented by one person or multiple people? And in fewer denominations? Isn't that something you want to think about? Something that you think there would be written in some book somewhere? Maybe that you could look at in your spare time and maybe just digest in your own personal free will? Maybe as you look at the ballots you're going to vote this proxy season, you take into consideration that there's an underlying factor and that there are other powers that be and perhaps conflict of interests exist. Maybe perhaps making your vote more significant than maybe perhaps you think. Maybe if you don't vote your proxies, why aren't the institutions going to vote them the right ways either? Maybe if you took initiative yourself and, took some responsibility for the shares you held in your little Robinhood account that you used to play around with and gamble your stocks and talk to your friends about with, oh, look at this, I did this with this XYZ stock, but I'm not going to vote my proxies because I'm just, I ain't got the time for that. I like to watch the flashing lights that go up when the things go green, and when they go down, I like to see the options that do the puts and the pulls and the, you Proxyopolists make me sick. Because those little funds that you're holding, all of them have an asset manager that delegate voting responsibility from the investor to the investment manager. And you should really look into how that investment manager is voting your proxies. Especially if you're not going to vote them yourselves in your little apps or whatever. Who's or what's it's. I don't know who your broker is, and I frankly don't give a damn. But you got to vote your proxies. And this is to teach you how. In this podcast. It's about time you fucking learned, okay? I'm sick and tired of everyone complaining about how all these things end up, and nobody's like, well, I could have made a difference. You fucking could have made a difference. You could have voted your goddamn proxies. I don't mean to get fresh, but I mean, it's an explicit podcast. You see that little E down there? That doesn't just stand for executive entrenchment factor or EVE. It It stands for explicit, as in you got to explicitly vote them proxies, y'all. And this is the intermission, and I'm speaking directly to the Proxyopolis at home right now. The Proxyopolis listening, the Proxyopolis not listening because they're taking a shit that's too loud for them to hear. I'm talking to you. You need some proxy paper to wipe your ass with? Check out the Patreon and the Linktree at Linktree/NASCAR. If you can hear me over that loud-ass shit you're taking over there. I'm just a jackal of trades trying to tell you why your life sucks because you don't vote your proxies. Don't mind me, y'all. Just check out the Proxyopoly TM proprietary research reports on the Linktree at Linktree/NASCAR. Click on the Patreon link or any of the other links. You're going to have yourself a great time on there, especially if your life sucks so much because you don't vote your damn proxies. So, this is the end of intermission number 2. We will be segueing casually into the third part of this Proxyopoly TM episode where we dive into how you're going to vote for the board of directors for Microsoft. Isn't that exciting? Don't you want to make an impact in a positive manner, but also take into consideration that there are consequences to each of these votes? For or against, abstain or withhold, there are consequences. And we're going to analyze that based on a policy and guidelines which has been trained and thoroughly vetted to produce this Proxyopoly TM research report for your listening pleasure and your reading pleasure on the Patreon. I'm just trying to tell it to you like it is, Proxyopolis. Now moving on to part 3 of this Proxyopoly TM episode. And now, introducing the third and final segment of this Proxyopoly TM episode, Board of Directors Voting Recommendations for the 2025 AGM of Microsoft Corporation. In the following segment of this episode, Proxyopoly TM lists each director up for election on the December 5th, 2025 annual general meeting of Microsoft Corporation with a recommended vote for, against, abstain, or withhold, supplemented by a brief rationale. These recommendations are grounded in the Proxyopoly TM analysis, considering each director's contributions, conflicts, and accountability to shareholders. First director on the board up for election on the docket today, we have Reid Hoffman. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: against. Based on the rationale that Hoffman's potential conflicts of interest and controversial public behavior make him an ill-suited fiduciary at this time. As a venture capitalist deeply embedded in AI startups, Hoffman has had to resign from OpenAI's board to, quote, avoid conflicts of interest, unquote, while backing other artificial intelligence companies. Yet he remains on Microsoft's board, where Microsoft's over $13 billion OpenAI partnership could present overlapping interests. There is a risk that Hoffman's myriad tech investments could cloud his judgment on Microsoft's strategy, even if recusing where obvious. Additionally, Hoffman has courted unneeded controversy. A shareholder advocacy group, NLPC, has for 2 years urged Microsoft investors to oust him, citing his, quote, extreme and intemperate, unquote, political attacks and his past association with Jeffrey Epstein. While Hoffman is a tech luminary, these issues raise serious questions about his judgment and focus. His board attendance and contributions are not publicly in question, but the baggage he brings risks distracting from Microsoft's mission and tainting its reputation. Voting against Hoffman sends a message that directors must put Microsoft's interest above personal agendas and avoid conduct unbecoming of a corporate leader. Next director on the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Hugh F. Johnston. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: abstain or withhold support. Based on the rationale that Johnston, the chief financial officer of Disney and former chief financial officer of PepsiCo, offers strong financial expertise, but concerns about overcommitment and recent performance warrant an abstain to withhold support from. Johnston took on the high-pressure Disney CFO role in 2023, a critical period as Disney undergoes turnaround efforts, meaning his bandwidth is stretched. Proxy advisors Glass Lewis and Institutional Shareholder Services generally advise that a sitting CFO serve on no more than one outside board. Johnston is right at that limit, Microsoft being his one outside directorship. In 2024, Johnston received only 91.9% support, the lowest of Microsoft's entire slate of directors up for election, suggesting some shareholders share these reservations. Moreover, Disney struggles and heavy finance workload for Johnston raise doubt whether he can dedicate sufficient attention to Microsoft's complex issues, such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence oversight, etc., beyond pure finance. On the audit committee, Johnston's deep experience is valuable, so we stop short at a full against. However, an abstain vote is merited to signal that shareholders are monitoring his ability to judge commitments and to encourage Microsoft's board to have a contingency plan, such as grooming another audit expert and so on, if Johnston cannot maintain excellence in both roles. If Johnston demonstrates continued strong engagement at Microsoft or steps back from other obligations, this reservation could be lifted in the future. Next director on the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Teri L. List. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: abstain or withhold support. Rationale based on the fact that List is a seasoned finance executive, former chief financial officer of Gap Inc. and Dick's Sporting Goods, who brings accounting acumen. She has diligently served on Microsoft's audit committee and earned a high 98.7% support last year. However, looking forward, Microsoft's needs are evolving beyond traditional retail/CPG finance skill sets. With artificial intelligence and cloud transformation at the core of Microsoft's strategy, the board may need to rebalance its skills. List's background in retail, while useful for oversight of budgeting and operations, is somewhat peripheral to Microsoft's current challenges. For example, artificial intelligence ethics, antitrust, developer ecosystems, and so on. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting abstain or withholding support from List as a gentle push for board refreshment. This is not a rebuke of her performance, but by all accounts she has been a steady hand, but rather a signal that Microsoft might consider adding fresh perspectives or diverse perspectives in her seat over the next year or two. An abstention encourages the board's nominating committee to evaluate whether it's time to rotate in someone with, say, deep cloud technology experience or public policy expertise. If no such candidate is ready, keeping List is acceptable. but shareholders should keep the option open. Essentially, abstaining preserves flexibility. It's a nod to list service, but an invitation for the board to contemplate planned succession in its ranks. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Catherine MacGregor. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation 4. Based on the rationale that MacGregor, CEO of NG, a global energy company, is a valuable recent addition to the board and merits continued support. Elected in 2023, she received a resounding 99.8% approval, indicating broad shareholder confidence. MacGregor brings critical industry diversity, expertise in energy infrastructure, renewables, and European markets, all relevant as Microsoft pursues sustainability goals and massive data center expansions, which have huge power needs. Her outsider perspective from a highly regulated industry likely strengthens Microsoft's approach to regulation and climate strategy. Additionally, as a female CEO of a major international company, MacGregor contributes to board diversity in both gender and global viewpoints. Her early contributions, though mostly confidential, likely include insight on Microsoft's efforts to power its artificial intelligence cloud growth responsibility. There are no red flags in her tenure. She is independent and has known conflicts. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for to reinforce the board's move to include such globally savvy, technically adept directors. MacGregor's presence directly addresses some governance gaps. She's neither a tech insider nor a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, but a pragmatic operator who can ask tough questions on execution and risk management. This is exactly the kind of director Microsoft needs more of. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Mark L. Mason. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation 4. Based on the rationale, Mason, Chief Financial Officer of Citigroup, earns a 4 vote as a strong contributor providing financial and strategic oversight, as well as enhancing board diversity. Mason is one of the few black executives on Microsoft's board, and his perspective from leading finance at a global bank is invaluable. He understands risk management and regulatory compliance deeply, skills that translate well as Microsoft navigates financial investments. For example, huge AI capital expenditures and complex global operations. Mason joined the board in 2020 and has since been a steady voice on fiscal discipline and audit matters. His re-election in 2024 with approximately 99.6% support reflects investor approval. Proxyopoly TM acknowledges potential concerns. Citi's performance has been under market expectations, and being Chief Financial Officer of Citigroup is demanding. However, Mason has thus far balanced his roles effectively, with perfect attendance and engagement per Microsoft's disclosures. He is also well within overboarding guidelines, only on Microsoft board outside Citi. Mason's continued presence on the board helps ensure stringent financial governance at Microsoft. He can expertly vet big-ticket projects like the $30 billion quarterly capex for artificial intelligence. His input is especially important as Microsoft manages risk of a possible economic downturn or integration of acquisitions. In short, Mason brings the right mix of financial acumen and conscientious oversight. Shareholders should confidently vote for his re-election. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Sandra E. Peterson. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation against. based on the rationale that Peterson, the lead independent director, is a seasoned pharmaceutical executive and has chaired Microsoft's governance committee. Paradoxically, we recommend against her re-election as a referendum on the board's leadership structure and independence. As lead independent director since 2021, Peterson's chief responsibility is to counterbalance the CEO chair roles by Nadella. Yet, under her watch, the board has entrenched Nadella's dual role and has been slow to address other governance concerns. While Peterson's background, former Johnson & Johnson executive, provides valuable insight on product safety and strategy, shareholders must ask, has she assertively led for truly independent oversight? The answer seems to be no. Key governance lapses during her tenure include maintaining the CEO as board chair, an entrenchment we argue at Proxyopoly should be remedied, and resisting reasonable shareholder proposals that would enhance transparency as a governance issue. As governance committee chair, Peterson bears responsibility for the decision to oppose separating the chair-CEO roles and for the board's lukewarm response to shareholder voices. Voting against Peterson is not a personal slight to her industry expertise, but a pointed message that independent leadership needs to be more than a title. If Peterson is voted down, an unlikely but statement-making scenario, the board would be compelled to rethink its structure, possibly appointing a truly independent chair or at least recentering the role of lead independent director with new energy. This recommendation is admittedly stern, given Peterson's otherwise solid reputation, but Microsoft's governance beta demands bold action. Sometimes changes at the top of the board is needed to cascade cultural change throughout. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Penny S. Pritzker. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation 4. Based on the rationale that Pritzker brings a rare blend of public policy, economic, and entrepreneurial expertise to Microsoft's board, and shareholders should vote for her continued service. A former U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Pritzker provides insight into government relations and regulatory affairs, a crucial skill set as Microsoft faces antitrust reviews, artificial intelligence, regulations, and geopolitical issues. She is also an accomplished business leader, founder of PSP Partners with expertise in real estate and civic investment. On Microsoft's board since 2017, Pritzker has been a consistent advocate for sound governance. Notably, her governmental background likely proved useful during Microsoft's navigation of the Activision acquisition during its regulatory approvals. She chairs the Regulatory and Public Policy Committee at Microsoft and has pushed Microsoft to be proactive on issues like workforce skilling and broadband expansion, areas she is vocally passionate about. Pritzker's re-election support was 99.6% last year, indicating strong shareholder trust. She also adds value to the board's gender diversity and brings an independent mindset unencumbered by Silicon Valley groupthink. With no conflicts of interest, her family's investments do not conflict with Microsoft's core business, and ample time to dedicate, being not overboarded, Pritzker is exactly the kind of director for shareholders which they should endorse. Her policy acumen will be especially valuable as AI regulation looms. She can help Microsoft find a path that satisfies authorities while preserving innovation. 4. Pritzker is an easy choice as a vote to strengthen the board's breadth. Next director of the board up for re-election. On the docket today, we have Carlos A. Rodriguez. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation 4. Based on the rationale that Rodriguez, the former CEO of Automatic Data Processing, or ADP, is a proven executive with expertise in enterprise services and human capital management. A vote for his re-election. Rodriguez led ADP through successful growth and an activist board battle, showcasing his acumen in strategy and stakeholder management. On Microsoft's board, he contributes insight on cloud-based services. Notably, ADP transitioned to cloud platforms under his watch, and the importance of talent and culture in driving tech innovation. He also improves the board's diversity and Latino representation. Rodriguez joined the board in 2021, and his support in 2024 was a solid 98.2%. Importantly, since retiring from ADP's CEO role in early 2023, he likely has more time and freedom to focus on Microsoft. Even more, with workforce issues top of mind, Microsoft has had significant layoffs and reorganizations alongside its AI investments. Rodriguez's HR and operations background is invaluable in board discussions on how artificial intelligence will augment or replace jobs, and how Microsoft can retain its workforce with ADP's wheelhouse. There are no notable governance concerns associated with Rodriguez. By all accounts, he is an active, independent director. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for to continue benefiting from Rodriguez's experience in scaling services securely and profitably. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Charles W. Scharf. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation against. Based on the rationale that Scharf, Chief Executive Officer of Wells Fargo and a respected finance veteran, nonetheless garners an against recommendation due to overextension and mixed governance track record. Scharf is juggling one of the most demanding chief executive officer jobs in corporate America, turning around Wells Fargo after years of scandals, and at the same time, serving on Microsoft's board. Even though Wells Fargo just achieved a milestone with Fed lifting its asset cap in 2025, a victory under Scharf's leadership, the bank still requires intense focus to fully rebuild trust. Scharf's primary duty is to Wells Fargo shareholders. Proxyopoly questions whether he can also give 100% to Microsoft's complex oversight, especially as Microsoft dives into novel arenas like generative AI. Furthermore, while Scharf has improved governance at Wells Fargo, leading to the cap removal as a, quote, pivotal milestone, unquote, some critics feel progress took too long. On Microsoft's board, Scharf's input on finance is somewhat redundant. The board already has 2 CFOs and other finance experts. His perspective might be too bank-centric. Moreover, Scharf's presence could pose conflicts of interest concerns. Big banks like Wells Fargo are major Microsoft clients and partners. Although such conflicts are manageable, having a current mega bank CEO on the board could constrain discussions around financial services strategies or cloud contracts with banks. Scharf might need to recuse himself at times. Given these factors, voting against Scharf encourages Microsoft to find a director who can be fully dedicated and more tech-focused without overstretch. This is a case where even an excellent executive might not be the right fit for the board's future needs. Microsoft would lose some financial savvy if Scharf goes. but that gap can be filled by others, such as retaining Mason or Johnston. I don't really, sure, why not? On balance, shareholders are justified in prioritizing a board seat for someone who isn't wearing two very large hats. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have John W. Stanton. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation against. Based on the rationale that Stanton, a telecom pioneer and longtime Seattle area business figure, shouldn't be removed in favor of fresh blood. So vote against. Stanton has been on the board since 2014, over a decade, making him one of the longest tenured directors at Microsoft. While expertise has value, Microsoft's board risks stagnation if members serve indefinitely. Stanton's background is in wireless telecom. He built and sold several mobile companies, and he currently invests via Trilogy partnerships. However, Microsoft exited the phone handset business years ago and is now focused on cloud, artificial intelligence, and enterprise software, areas outside Stanton's core expertise. His entrepreneurial viewpoint was likely useful when Microsoft was finding its post-PC footing, but the company's challenges in 2025, namely AI competition, global regulation, cloud cyber risks, and so on, are far afield. Additionally, Stanton is over 60, in fact, likely in his late 60s, and Microsoft has no mandatory retirement age, so without shareholder action, he could serve indefinitely. It's prudent to rotate him out to make room for a new director with skills in, say, artificial intelligence or cybersecurity, as we recommended in policy changes section of this podcast. Notably, Stanton holds the role of chair of the compensation committee. Under his watch, Microsoft's executive pay has been generous. And while there haven't been say-on-pay failures, shareholders might prefer fresh perspectives on aligning pay with environmental, social, governance goals. Stanton's 2024 support was 99.4%, implying shareholders haven't been concerned, likely due to Microsoft stock performance. But governance best practices don't wait for a crisis to refresh. Voting against Stanton is a proactive step to inject new thinking. Microsoft can honor its contributions, but it's time to evolve the board's composition to match the company's future focus. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Emma N. Walmsley. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote for. Based on the rationale that Walmsley, CEO of global pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline plc, is a highly valuable board member bringing cross-industry innovation and risk management experience. Walmsley is one of the few sitting CEOs on Microsoft's board beside Nadella and Scharf, and she offers a perspective rooted in science, healthcare, and consumer products. In an era where Microsoft is exploring healthcare applications of artificial intelligence, Walmsley's insights are directly relevant. She knows how to navigate heavily regulated industries and has led GlaxoSmithKline through significant change, including research and development, culture shifts, and a spin-off. This expertise translates well to Microsoft's needs in ethical product development and navigating regulatory scrutiny like FDA oversight that artificial intelligence in healthcare might invite. Additionally, Walmsley's presence strengthens diversity, being one of only 5 women on the board, and an international outlook as a British CEO, giving non-U.S. market viewpoints. Although GlaxoSmithKline has faced its own challenges and an activist investor in recent years, Walmsley has proven resilient and adaptive, traits beneficial to Microsoft's board. She was re-elected with 99.1% support in 2024, reflecting shareholder confidence. There's no indication of overboarding. GlaxoSmithKline and Microsoft are her two commitments, which is fairly reasonable for a CEO of a major company. If anything, Walmsley's external perspectives helps counter any tech echo chamber tendencies on the board. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for Walmsley as her continued stewardship will help Microsoft responsibly scale new frontiers like artificial intelligence in life sciences and ensure the company doesn't succumb to groupthink. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Satya Nadella. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Against. Based on the rationale that this may be the most controversial recommendation, but Proxyopoly TM advocates a vote against Satya Nadella's re-election as director, not due to his performance demerits, but to send a clear signal demanding improved governance structure. Nadella has been an outstanding CEO, undeniably driving Microsoft's revival and growth. However, as discussed, and per the Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policies and guidelines, his dual role as chairperson and CEO represents a structural governance flaw. By voting against, shareholders can communicate that while they appreciate Nadella's leadership, they want independent board oversight of that leadership. In practical terms, Nadella's removal from the board, were it to happen, would not remove him as CEO, but it would force the board to appoint a new independent chairperson. This is precisely the outcome needed to implement Proxyopoly TM's top recommendation. It is not a vote against Nadella's strategy, it's a vote for checks and balances. One might argue an abstention could suffice as a mild protest, but given the board's inertia, they voluntarily gave him the chair title in 2021. Only a strong shareholder stance will prompt change. Nadella received approximately 94.3% support in 2024, notably lower than almost all other directors, indicating some investors already share these governance worries. That margin likely reflects proxy advisors' policies against combined chairperson/CEO roles. This year, the case for withholding support is even stronger. Microsoft's influence in society via artificial intelligence, etc., has grown, and so has the need for robust oversight. Let Proxyopoly TM be clear. Voting against Nadella as director is not a referendum on his execution as CEO, which has been excellent. It is a referendum on Microsoft's board leadership model. In an ideal world, Nadella would remain as CEO and an esteemed advisor on the board, but relinquish the chairperson role to an independent party, aligning Microsoft with best governance practices of its peers. Sometimes even superstar CEOs must be subject to structural discipline for the long-term good of the company and its stakeholders. Proxyopoly TM urges shareholders to make this tough call, confident that Microsoft's depth of talent on the board and management will continue to thrive under a more balanced power arrangement. In concluding this segment and this podcast, these recommendations blend respect for tremendous success Microsoft has achieved under current management with a hard-nosed insistence on future-proofing its governance. By voting thoughtfully, supporting directors who add needed value, and opposing or abstaining from those who symbolize or contribute to governance weaknesses. Microsoft's shareholders can help instill changes that reduce volatility and risk in the public health of free markets. Microsoft is entering a new era of pervasive artificial intelligence and global influence. Its governance must evolve accordingly, lest it become a case study in unchecked corporate power. A recalibrated board armed with diverse expertise and led by an independent chairperson will not impede Microsoft's innovation. It will enhance it by ensuring decisions are rigorous, ethical, and consider the broad stakeholder landscape. The Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.65 is a wake-up call. Microsoft's governance, while not toxic, skews toward entrenchment. Fortunately, the prescriptions provided by Proxyopoly TM are straightforward. Shareholders, by casting their proxies as recommended, can assert their rightful role in steering Microsoft towards a slightly more modest, transparent, and accountable governance model, one befitting the world-changing company that Microsoft is today. Thus concluding this episode of the Proxyopoly TM podcast, the Proxyopoly TM score for Microsoft, we now conclude with the final disclaimer. The Proxyopoly TM score and accompanying analysis are purely hypothetical for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world events is purely coincidental, though with Microsoft's current trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than we anticipated. And that's all we have for today, Proxyopolis. If it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopolying.